There is someone in almost every family, every office, every group of friends who seems to have an opinion about everything you do. The way you raised your kids, the way you spend your money, the way you dress, the way you talk, the way you live your life. I have noticed something strange about these people over the years. They are not always loud. They are not always cruel. Sometimes they say it with a smile, sometimes with a sigh, sometimes with nothing more than a raised eyebrow at exactly the wrong moment. And yet you walk away from the conversation feeling smaller than you did before it started. I think most of us have someone like this in our lives. And I think, if we are honest, some of us have caught ourselves becoming this person too, just for a moment, in a moment of frustration or fear. So I want to ask you something before we go any further. What if the people who judge everyone are not judging you at all? What if they never really were? There is a man I want you to picture. He could be your uncle, your old boss, your father, or someone you went to school with. Let's just call him he, because he could be almost anyone. He sits at the dinner table and has something to say about every plate that gets passed around. He watches the news and knows with total certainty exactly what every politician, every celebrity, every stranger on the screen should have done differently. He listens to his coworkers describe a problem, and before they even finish the sentence, he already has the solution and a small comment about how he would never have made that mistake in the first place. Psychologists have a simple way of describing what is actually happening here. It is called projection. It means that the qualities a person cannot stand to see in themselves get pushed outward onto someone else where they feel safer to criticize. If he cannot stand the idea of being lazy, he will see laziness everywhere, in his employees, his children, his neighbors. If he is terrified of being seen as foolish, he will be the first to call out foolishness in others, often before anyone else has even noticed it. It is not really about the other person's plate, or the politician, or the coworker's mistake. It is about something he is trying very hard not to look at inside himself. Think about how often this shows up in ordinary moments that have nothing to do with anything serious. A man who cannot stand the idea of being seen as weak will be the harshest one in the room when someone else cries, calling them dramatic, oversensitive, unable to handle pressure. A woman who is terrified of being thought of as selfish will be the first to whisper about a friend who finally said no to a request, calling her cold, calling her changed. In both cases, the comment tells you almost nothing about the person being judged and almost everything about the fear living quietly inside the person doing the judging. You may recognize a version of this in someone close to you. You may have spent years wondering why their criticism felt so personal, so sharp, when the thing they were criticizing seemed so small. It felt personal because in a strange way, it was, just not about you.
So here is what I want to do with you over the next few minutes. I want to walk through the signs that someone has built their entire identity around judging others, one layer at a time. We will start with the behaviors that are easy to spot, the ones you have probably noticed in someone you know without ever putting a name to them. Then we will go deeper into the quieter signs, the ones that hide underneath good manners and reasonable-sounding opinions. And by the end, we will arrive at the real engine running underneath all of it, the fear that almost nobody admits to, not even to themselves. I am not going to give you a list to memorize. I want you to follow this the way you would follow a thought, because that is exactly what this is. Let's start with the version of this that is the easiest to see. The first thing you usually notice is that nothing is ever quite good enough. He walks into a restaurant, and the first thing out of his mouth is a complaint about the lighting or the music or the way the waiter greeted them. He watches a movie everyone else loved and immediately points out the 3 things wrong with it. He visits a friend's new apartment and somehow finds a way to mention the apartment he almost bought instead, the one with better windows. I have sat across from people like this in cafes and dinners more times than I can count, and there is a pattern that always shows up. The criticism rarely changes anything. It does not lead to a better restaurant being chosen next time or a more thoughtful conversation about the movie. It just sits there, a small flag planted to say, "I noticed the flaw before you did." This is what psychologists sometimes call a need for control through evaluation. If he can always find the flaw first, he never has to be the one caught off guard, impressed, or vulnerable. Being unimpressed feels safer than being moved. You may have felt this with someone close to you. You bring them something you're proud of, and instead of feeling celebrated, you feel quietly examined. That feeling does not come from your work being inadequate. It comes from standing in front of someone who has built a wall out of criticism, brick by brick, because the wall feels safer than being open. I think about a woman I once knew who described her father this way. She said that no matter what she brought home, a report card, a job offer, even a wedding date, his first reaction was always to find the one detail that was not quite right. Not cruelly, she said, almost automatically, like a reflex he didn't seem to notice in himself. She spent years assuming this meant she was never enough. It took her a long time to consider another possibility, that her father had simply never learned another way to respond to good news without feeling threatened by it somehow. But there is something underneath even this, something that explains why the wall went up in the first place. If you watch this kind of person a little longer, you start to notice something else. Their harshest judgments are almost always aimed at the exact things they are most insecure about. He criticizes people who change careers late in life, calling them flaky, unfocused, unable to commit. And if you happen to know his history, you might also know that he once wanted to leave his own job and never did, out of fear. He mocks people who go to therapy, calling it self-indulgent, a waste of money. And if you sit with him long enough, you start to sense a man who has never once let himself sit quietly with his own pain.
This is not a coincidence, and it is not really about hypocrisy in the way we usually think of it. It is closer to a kind of self-protection. If he attacks the thing he is afraid might be true about himself, loudly and publicly, he gets to feel like he stands on the opposite side of it. The judgment becomes a kind of shield. You probably know someone exactly like this, someone whose strongest opinions always seem to land suspiciously close to their own unspoken wounds. It is almost as if the loudness of the judgment is in direct proportion to how much it terrifies them to be that thing themselves. And once you see this pattern, you start to wonder what is actually happening underneath. What is so frightening that it has to be defended against this fiercely? This is where things get quieter and harder to see, because we are no longer just talking about behavior. We are talking about how someone learned to feel safe in the world a very long time ago. For many people who judge constantly, the harshest critic they have ever known is not standing in front of them at the dinner table. The harshest critic lives inside their own head. He grew up with a parent, a teacher, or some early figure who made love and approval feel conditional. Good grades earned warmth. Mistakes earned silence, or worse. Somewhere along the way, he learned a rule that never got spoken out loud but shaped almost everything. You are only safe, only acceptable, only lovable if you are better than the mistake in front of you. That rule does not disappear when the person grows up, it just changes targets. The voice that once said you are not good enough turns outward and starts pointing at everyone else instead, because pointing at others feels far less painful than pointing it at himself. Judging other people becomes, in a strange and sad way, a method of survival. If he can always find someone doing it wrong, he can quietly reassure himself that he is doing it right, even if some part of him has never actually believed that. You may have felt the echo of this if you grew up around someone who judged easily. You may have absorbed a version of that same voice, the one that critiques you before anyone else gets the chance to. That voice was never really about you either. It was inherited, passed down like an old coat that never quite fit, worn anyway because no one showed him how to take it off. What makes this especially hard to untangle is that the voice rarely announces itself as cruelty. It usually disguises itself as standards, as discipline, as simply telling the truth. He will say things like, "Someone has to keep people honest," or "I'm just being realistic." And in a way, he believes that completely, because the alternative would mean recognizing how much of his own life has been shaped by a fear he never chose and never quite escaped. There is a particular kind of sadness in watching someone defend a habit that is quietly costing them the closeness they actually want. Not because they are bad people, but because the habit was built so early and so quietly that questioning it can feel like questioning the ground they have stood on their whole life. There is one more layer, and it might be the most important one, because it explains why this pattern is so hard to break, even when someone wants to. Judging others, at its core, is often a way of avoiding intimacy. To truly know someone, to let them tell you their messy story without rushing to a verdict, requires a kind of openness that can feel unbearably exposed. It means sitting with uncertainty. It means admitting that life is complicated, that people make decisions for reasons you may never fully understand, that you yourself are not always right. He finds it far easier to deliver a quick judgment than to ask a real question. A verdict ends the conversation. A question opens it, and opening it means he might have to sit with someone else's pain, or worse, recognize a piece of his own. This is why people who judge constantly often seem strangely lonely, even when they are surrounded by others.
Judgment keeps people at a distance. It lets he feel powerful in the moment, but it slowly empties out every relationship of the closeness that might have actually made him feel less afraid in the first place. You may know someone who seems to have opinions about everyone, but very few people who actually feel close to him. That is not a coincidence either. It is the quiet cost of a lifetime spent keeping people just far enough away to judge them safely. Think about how rarely this kind of person asks a genuine question. Not the kind of question that is really a setup for an opinion, but the kind that simply wants to understand. How did that feel? What was going through your mind? What do you think you will do now? These questions require him to set down the verdict for a moment, and that can feel like standing without armor in a room he has spent years trying to control. It is a small thing, the absence of real questions, but it tends to be one of the clearest signs of all. So if we step back and look at everything we have just walked through, a fuller picture starts to come into focus. The flaw he always finds first is a way of staying in control. The judgments aimed at his own hidden fears are a shield against the parts of himself he cannot face. The harsh inner voice he learned long ago found somewhere else to point. And the distance he keeps from real intimacy is the price he pays to feel safe. None of these things on their own tell the whole story, but together they start to look less like a personality trait and more like a structure someone built, piece by piece, usually without ever choosing to, usually as a child trying to survive something that felt too big to face directly. I want you to sit with that for a moment, not as an excuse, because the impact of being judged constantly is real and it does hurt, but as a way of understanding what you might actually be standing in front of. I'm not going to tell you exactly what to do with this. I think that's something only you can work out in your own relationships with your own history. But I do want to ask you something. Is there someone in your life whose judgment has always felt heavier than it should, sharper than the moment actually called for? And is there a chance, even a small one, that what you were standing in front of was never really about you at all, but about a fear they've been carrying since long before they ever met you? And maybe there's another question worth sitting with too. Is there a version of that same voice living somewhere inside you, quietly judging yourself before anyone else gets the chance? That might be a conversation worth having with yourself on a day when you're ready for it. There's something else I've been thinking about, something that connects directly to everything we just walked through. It's the question of why some people seem to need everyone's approval, bending themselves into whatever shape keeps the peace, while others seem to need everyone's judgment, finding fault wherever they look. I have a feeling these two patterns are more closely related than they first appear, two different responses to a very similar kind of fear. If that question is sitting with you the way it's sitting with me, I think you'll want to see where it leads, because understanding one of these patterns tends to unlock the other. Thank you so much for staying with me through this one. I know it was not always an easy thing to look at. If something in this resonated with you, even just a little, I would love it if you hit like. It genuinely helps this find the people who need to hear it. And I would really love to know in the comments who came to mind for you while you were watching this. Was it someone else? Or, if you're willing to admit it, was it a little bit of yourself too? If you want to keep exploring how the mind protects itself in ways we rarely notice, consider subscribing. There's a lot more of this waiting for you. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one, you know what to do with that little bell. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.